Last week we had a message about the attack on the family, and you may remember some of what we discussed. That as I was sharing this with my family, my son made the observation, well, I hope that when you talk about attacks on the family, you talk about the attacks on the roles of the family. Because what we're discovering, especially in our country today, is a blurring of the roles of those two within the family, the father, the mother, well, actually three, and the children. There's a role for the children that somehow we've kind of confused a little as well. But this Sunday, I would like to talk to you about the role of the husband or the father there in the family. And I'm going to begin with a statement that I'm almost certain will get an amen. A man's home is his castle. Amen? Yeah, I thought I'd get a few of those. The question is, what do you mean by that? You see, to some that means as king of my castle, I'll do what I want when I want as long as I want. And the emphasis is on I'm the one in charge. But another way to look at that statement, and this is what I want us to look at today, is to say that while the world runs its course, there is a place of refuge. There is a fortified castle of provision and protection from the attacks that the world may wish to inflict. And in this sense, the home becomes the place, not only a preparation, but a provision and protection for the family. The emphasis is on castle, meaning a strong place to dwell. So we're going to look at the father's role when it comes to the home within the castle, because it's the father who ultimately is responsible for the preparation, the provision, and the protection of the family. We're going to start with the preparation, and I'm just going to simply say that fathers must actively be involved in the preparation of their family for the issues of life. In other words, in order to be a father of a castle in a home, you're going to have to be in the home. We're living in a day where absenteeism among fathers is rampant. And one of the greatest blights on our nation is the fact that those that are coming up with fatherless families, where the father has just not accepted any responsibility whatsoever. I want to remind you from the very get-go, Psalm 127:1 says, unless the Lord builds the house, well, they labor in vain who build it. Fathers, I want you to make note of some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. The psalmist, in fact, in that particular psalm, in Psalm 127, he says, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It's vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he gives his beloved sleep. And then he begins to talk about the family. Dads, let me remind you, children are a heritage from the Lord. Just a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how life begins in the womb. Well, the fruit of the womb is a reward, not a nuisance. We need to look at our families, especially our children, as that which God has given us. And the psalm says, like arrows in the hand of a warrior. You know what that means? That means your children are that which you are preparing to send out into the world like warriors and like arrows. I love the statement that he says, so are the children of one's youth. I love the statement that people used to say, well, happy is the man whose quiver is full of them. Well, I guess I had a small quiver. I only had about 3 children. Well, there's others that have greater quivers, but the important thing is what you're doing with those arrows. What are you doing with those children? So that they shall not be ashamed, but that they shall speak with their enemies. And I want you to make note of this last phrase, in the gate. And we're going to look more at that tonight, because when the Bible talks about gates, it talks about the places of influence. Decisions were made at the gate. In the Proverbs 31, the virtuous woman, her husband is well known in the gates. Judicial matters were decided in the gates. And so as such, it's important that we are preparing children to be able to go out into the world, to be influencers who are not to be ashamed and can speak strongly in the gates. The very next psalm, Psalm 128, is one of my favorite psalms about the family. And it addresses itself primarily also to the father, to the man, when it says, "Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. And when you eat the labor of your hands, you will be happy, and it shall be well with you." Well, you say, well, how do you know he's talking about the fathers? Because he goes on to say in verse 3, "Your wife will be like a fruitful vine in the very heart of your house." And we'll look more. Next week we're going to be looking at you and I, the church, as the object of God's greatest love. And in fact, I've entitled the message, "The Object of God's Jealousy." And if you ever wonder if there's ever a positive side to jealousy, come next week and you'll find that we serve a jealous God who is jealous for you. Not like the world would talk about being jealous of you. But God is jealous for you. And He wants to see families like we just sang about, where your children are like olive plants all around your table. "Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord." The greatest preparation for life will be found in the home. And unless the Lord builds the house, they who labor will labor in vain. We're called to prepare. We're called to train our family, to train our children to face the issues of life. Proverbs 22:6, very familiar passage. You know it. We've heard it shared many a time. "Train up a child in the way he should go. When he is old, he will not depart from it." Literally, that "in the way he should go" is according to his bend or according to his way. In other words, it's each child is individual, and you train them individually. There's no real cookie-cutter way to do it. You're going to have to work with the children in the way that they are. And when we do, we begin to train them. Well, what are we supposed to train them about? Well, Deuteronomy 6:4-7 talks about what the Jewish families call the Shema, the Hear, O Israel. And it begins with the passage that you know so well. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord He is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, and all your heart." Verse 6, "And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you," and look at these at least 4 times during the day, 4 different opportunities you have to speak into your children's lives the things of God. When you sit at your house, that's around the table. When you have a meal together, that's a great time to be having teachable moments. When you walk in the way. Now, we don't walk like they did. We drive. And so when you're taking a trip, that's a great time to be saying, "Hey, kids, let's talk about something." When you walk by the way. When you lie down as you're putting them to bed at night. And the first thing they do when they rise up in the morning. We have these opportunities that we are to speak into the life of our families, speak into the life of our children. And Paul even makes it clear in Ephesians chapter 6 when he says, "You fathers," he said, "don't provoke your children to wrath." And we talked about discipline before, how discipline is not punishment. We're not to be provoking them to wrath, but that discipline is designed to bring out fruits of righteousness, that they may be trained by it. And that's what Paul is saying here in Ephesians. "Do not provoke your children to wrath or frustrate them. Bring them up in the training and the admonition," or the encouragement, "of the Lord." Why? Because if the Lord doesn't build the house, everything we're doing in vain. We labor in vain. So the kind of training and admonition, we need to be giving them the knowledge of the Lord. You know, the Bible talks about a generation that knew not the Lord because their parents had no stories to tell them. The book of Judges, it says, "And there arose a generation who knew not the Lord." They had come out of Egypt. They had gone through all of these things. And yet somewhere along the way in the wilderness, they had just kind of let this all go. And now, after the conquest of the land, they came to a period where there just wasn't anything to talk, or where they just didn't talk about the mighty works of God. I want to encourage you families, and especially you fathers, to be actively involved in the preparation of your children for their spiritual development. That you be involved in telling them some Bible stories. Now, if that means you've got to learn some, then learn some. But you need to be involved in speaking into them about stories not only from the Scriptures, but stories of God's faithfulness in your family. All of us can recount a time when God answered a prayer. I got a question. Do your children know about those times? Do they know those times when God came through, showed up, and you were able to share them? We serve a faithful God. Something that they could even go to school and tell their classmates. Do you know what? My parents prayed about something and God showed up. These glory stories are ways in which we are feeding the spiritual lives of our children. And then there's just the basic instructions in life. Fathers, sometimes we need to start teaching our children more than just how to shave. We need to teach them how to be respectful. Teach them how to have integrity. How to give their word and to keep their word. And to model for them and teach them how to be honest. Like in areas of business. These instructions of life, these practical lessons, they're not old-fashioned. And they shouldn't be left to the grandparents. These are the things that come as preparation for the issues of life, and they come primarily through the father. Oh, the mother's there. And we're going to look more about the mother in about 2 weeks. We're going to look at the mother and the children in 2 weeks. We're going to look at some of the roles that she's going to be involved in. But dads, you have a role to play in the family. And it is a role of spiritual leadership in which you should be preparing your family, not just your children, but even your wife, for the issues of life. But there's a second area that you're responsible for. Not just preparation. You're responsible for provision. You see, the Bible tells us that the father must provide for the physical as well as we've talked about the spiritual needs of their family. Paul told Timothy, he said very simply, if anyone does not provide for his own, especially for those of his household, he's denied the faith and he's worse than an unbeliever. I'm not trying to take us back to the 50s, but there's a lot to be said about the father being the breadwinner. Now, I realize that wives work, and I realize that mothers work, and there's things that go on in that. But listen, you need to recognize your responsibility. That the responsibility falls to you to be the provider. Fathers need to learn and teach the scriptural principles of how God provides for the family. Shortly after I came to be with you, and by the way, I didn't mention this a week or so ago, but even though I will officially have been with you for a year, the first Sunday of March, I've already been preaching with you for over a year. I've started my second year now that we're in February. And shortly after I got here, there was a message that I shared about Elijah, about the one true source. And some of you may even remember where you got out your phones and you texted, God is my one true source. That truth has never changed. We want to continue to re-emphasize over and over until it finally sinks in that God is the one true source of our provision. Everything else, our work, some of the other things that we'll look at in just a moment that God sends our way, those are resources. But God is our source. And we should never be so overly concerned about the resource that we lose sight of the source. We need to be realizing and then teaching the principle of God's provision. We need to remember that God's the true source. Everything else is a resource. And that Philippians 4:19 says, it is my God, not my job. It is my God, not my pension. It is my God, not my 401k, that shall supply all your need according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus. God is our one true source. And we should learn from the Heavenly Father the difference between providing for the needs of the household and indulging every whim of the household. There's wisdom involved in that provision. Wisdom that tells us some things are needs and some things aren't, and we need to know the difference. Remember, God revealed himself to us as a father, not a grandfather. Grandfathers just simply give to us because we ask for it. But fathers give for our good and for the family as a whole. And we need to realize that we are, as fathers, to be patterning our lives from our Heavenly Father. Well, how does God provide, by the way? I found this interesting. I found this a long time ago. I thought this was worth sharing. I found at least 3 areas through which God provides. If you want to write these down, these would be important. This would be good to have in your software. God provides through work. You say, well, I wasn't really kind of hoping for it. No, that's the primary way that God provides. God provides through work. And in fact, Paul even went as far to tell one church, if a man won't work, don't let him eat. But here's what he says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, that you also aspire to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work with your own hands, as we have commanded you. Why? That you may walk properly toward those who are outside, and that you may lack nothing. You want the provision in your household you need? We're living in a day and age where there is a worker shortage. There shouldn't be anybody out there who can't find a job. Some people can't find jobs today for the same reason that some thieves can't find a policeman. They're just not looking for them. But you and I need to recognize the priority and the provision that God has built into for us through work. I can't say that strong enough. He provides through work, but then there are times, and I've been a recipient of this, and I've been on the other side of this, where not only through work does God provide, but He provides through gifts. You ever had that happen to you? I mean, just out of the blue, and you didn't know where it came from, and all of a sudden God just met a need. This is where some of those glory stories come in. That there was an urgent need that your work wasn't going to be able to cover, but God covered it. And He did so maybe through somebody else, or something that was unexpected. I'll never forget, this was early days of our marriage. We had the car break down, and when cars break down, it was a real problem, because you don't budget for those things. And I was actually down visiting in Millington. We lived in Milan at the time, but I was visiting my sister's house in Millington, and my car broke down. I had to get it fixed while I was in Millington, and I didn't know how I was going to pay for it. I mean, I had money in the bank to pay for it, but that money was already scheduled for and budgeted for food and things for the month. And while I was there, one of our neighbors who knew me when I lived at home, my dad lived next door, and I was brought up next door. She came down. She knew I was visiting. She said, "Randy, are you going back?" I said, "Well, if my car gets fixed, I'm going back today." She says, "Our freezer just went out, and we've got to unload a whole bunch of food. Can you take something back and make use of it?" And lo and behold, if the amount of food and the value of the food that they gave me to take home with me wasn't as great, if not greater, than the car repair. That God just answered a prayer with a gift from somebody else that He had placed on their heart. Churches engage in this as well, but it's called benevolence. And there's different areas in which God provides unbudgeted needs through aid, and He does it through God's people many times. And systems that are already set up to help. So through work, through gifts, through aid, God provides. And fathers not only need to learn this, they need to teach this. And while you're teaching that, teach them where God doesn't provide through. I think this is just as significant, because some of it, well, one of these is going to seem obvious, the other is not going to seem so obvious. God doesn't provide through stealing. He also doesn't provide through gambling. And I'll go a step further. God doesn't provide through credit. Now, I won't unpack this as much today as I would like. If given the opportunity, I would love to come back and address this, but just simply to say that credit is spending what you don't have to buy what you don't need to keep up with people you don't like in the first place. Credit is extending what you think you need to cover by borrowing funds that you now have become indebted to. The big problem with credit is debt. And that's the thing that I think God is really wanting us to be aware of. And the sooner we teach our children, the better off they'll be in the issues of life. You know, Paul said, let him who stole steal no longer. That's not a way that God provides. But rather, and goes back to work, let him labor. Working with his hands what is good, that he may have something, I love this, that he may have something to give him who has need. And now he's saying your work becomes a source for which you then can be a gift for others, or a resource where you can be a gift to others. Charles Wesley discovered that he needed so much money to live on. And he told God, this is how much I need. And God was meeting that need. But then as Charles Wesley began to preach more and more, God began to bless him more and more. And more income came in. And do you know what he started doing? Everything that was above that line of what he needed, he started giving away. And I've read that by the time Charles Wesley died, he was giving away more than he was keeping to take care of his needs, because he didn't increase his standard of living by the income or the flow that came into him. He just kept it constant and said, this is the stuff that I will channel through. God says, let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to give him who has need. There's a lot to say about finances and household provision. Let me summarize it with 4 words. I learned these words very early in my marriage, and boy, I'm glad I did. And I've taught them to my children, and I want to pass them on to you. The greatest principle of provision that you will ever learn is that you need to learn to live beneath your means. You've heard of the expression, live within your means. Well, that just gets you from paycheck to paycheck. Find where you can live beneath your means, and there will always be something for you to be able to give. Either to give to God and his work and ministry, or to give to others that are in need. But learn to live beneath your means and teach your children to do the same, and you will save them heartache. You will save them all kinds of problems. We as fathers, we need to be preparing our families. We need to be providing for our families and teaching our children and our families the principles of how God provides, and we need to be protecting our families. There is no doubt most men would defend with their very lives the security and protection of their family from any known intruder in their home. Now, I'll be honest with you. I'm a Second Amendment advocate. I just don't own a gun because I'm afraid. I'm afraid of guns. I believe in disaster relief, but I don't operate a chainsaw either. I want you to know that we need to be able to protect our families. I remember when I went to New Bern, one of the deacons came to me and he says, I just need you to know, Brother Randy, that I'm packing, and there's about 4 others in the church that are. I said, I'm glad to know that. I mean, it doesn't bother me, but the main thing is, I know you're here to help protect should somebody come in and do something. I'm all about protection. But in most intruders would have to go through their father before they would get to the family, but that doesn't always stand the test when it comes to Satan. When Jesus was talking about casting out demons, it's important that and I should have put this up earlier, fathers must protect their families from both physical but also spiritual threats. Jesus stated this in a principle when he said in Matthew 12:29, how can one enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man? And then he'll plunder his house. Satan is seeking ways to bind our fathers. Satan is seeking ways to bind the men of the house, the men of the castle, and he's doing it through sin, and sin binds. One of the areas that Satan uses is that of idolatry. You say, well, we don't have any idols in our house. I don't know what you mean by idolatry. Idolatry is anything that displaces the rightful place of Christ from His glory in our lives. Idolatry is anything that comes between us and God. You know, the rich young ruler said, I kept all the commandments, but the one he kept missing was the first one. You shall have no other gods before me. Because he had made gold his God. Idolatry can come in a lot of forms, and with some fathers it's real easy for their career or their fame to become that which they are more concerned about than the issues of God. Material possessions, we can talk a lot about these things, or money itself. You know the scriptures already that the love of money is the root, not money, but love of money is the root of all evil, and that no man can serve two masters. And Jesus said that specifically in talking about money. He says he'll either love one and hate the other, or he'll cling to one and reject the other. Idolatry is when something comes between you and your spiritual leadership of the family. And so we want to be careful of idolatry. Probably the strongest attack that Satan gives is addiction. And this is built on all kinds of the lusts of the flesh. We've seen the lust of that can affect us in idolatry. The lust of the flesh is seen in addiction. The praise team sang. And I sat in here during the rehearsal, and then I listened to it again. When we talked about God so loved the world, it talks about all our addictions. And we may be slow to talk about addiction, especially when it touches our own lives. But we have substance addictions that we need to be aware of. Things that get out of control before we can recognize it. And a substance addiction, it can be alcohol, it can be drugs, it can be food for that matter. Paul used it this way when he shared with the church at Corinth. And Corinth, as you probably have been told by now, was one of the most carnal churches that Paul ever had to deal with and address in his letters. They had a saying that was coming from their Epicurean philosophers, all things are lawful to me. Where Paul put it back on them. He said in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12, he quotes them when he says, all things are lawful to me. But then he says, but not all things are helpful. Your Bible may say expedient. All things are lawful to me, but not all things are expedient. Not all things are helpful. And then he repeats it again. All things are lawful to me. That's what you say. But then he makes this statement, I will not be brought under the power of any of them. Addiction takes place, whether it's a substance or anything. We're going to see some others in just a second, that starts telling you when you're going to have to engage in it. I remember Gary Paxton, way back in the 80s, wrote a song called There Goes a Cigar and It's Smoking a Man. You know, when something tells you, you've got to do this. Whether it is alcohol, whether it is drugs, whether it is even food. When something says, you've got to do this, it has master over you. Paul says, all things are lawful to me, but I will not be mastered by none of them. Why? Because when I come under addiction, I've lost control. And I do damaging things. I do damaging things to myself. I do damaging things to my family. And that's why Satan knows that one of his best attacks is going to be in the area of addiction. It's not just substance abuse. It can be sexual immorality. It can be pornography. The greatest addiction that's taking place today is internet addiction. And it is cutting across all lines. I was in a pastor's evangelism conference last Monday, and one of the pastors who was preaching was talking to nothing but pastors for the most part. There were some others that had come for the evangelism. But talking to pastors primarily, he referred to it as the silent sin. It's just that thing we don't talk about. Pornography, sexual immorality, internet addiction. Solomon had some very wise words to say in Proverbs, and he kind of covered them over a little so they'd be a little palatable. But listen carefully and you'll know exactly what he's talking about. Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your fountains be dispersed abroad? Should they be streams of water in the streets? Let them be only your own and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed. And then he makes it pretty clear, and rejoice with the wife of your youth. 3 verses later, he gets even clearer than that. Why should you, my son, be enraptured by an immoral woman and be embraced in the arms of a seductress? For the ways of man, they're before the eyes of the Lord. He's right there with you and your computer. He ponders all of his paths, the paths of the man. And his own iniquities entrap the wicked one, the wicked man. And notice this last line. And he is caught in the cords of his sin. You want to know what binds? What binds is the cords of sin. Don't be bound by immorality. Don't be bound by idolatry. Don't be bound by immorality. Learn from the man who thought he could control his own lust, Samson. We won't go there, but you can. Look at Judges chapter 16 sometime today. Samson played with temptation, thinking he was strong enough to handle it. And with each temptation of Delilah, he came closer and closer to the truth till he finally gave in and was overtaken and was blinded. Even Samson wasn't strong enough to play with temptation when it came to immorality. He ended up literally bound and blinded by his own sin. Now, on the other hand, and we're studying him in Sunday school, looked at this story just about a week or so ago. Look at Joseph. Faced with the same opportunity of immorality and temptation from Potiphar's wife, he left his coat in her hand just to get out of there. He saturated her presence with his absence. He got out of the temptation. He found the way to escape. In other words, he did what Paul told Timothy to do. Flee. That's the only real way you can battle this, is just flee. Flee also youthful lusts. And it doesn't matter how youthful you are, they're youthful lusts. But pursue righteousness, faith, love, peace with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. Well, idolatry, addiction. There's a third one that I want to share with you this morning as we kind of bring this to a close. It's called apathy. And apathy is nothing but a lack of spiritual passion. It is a laziness of the soul that simply looks at their life and says, I got better things to be doing than to go to church. I got better things to be doing than reading my Bible. I got better things to be doing than praying. And this apathy toward God, forgetting that unless the Lord builds the house, they who build it labor in vain. There's a prophet by the name of Zephaniah who wrote on this very subject. He says in chapter 1, verse 12, "It shall come to pass after that time that I," that's the Lord speaking, "will search Jerusalem with lamps and punish the men," notice it's the men, "punish the men who are settled in complacency, in apathy, who say in their heart, it don't matter. The Lord will not do good, nor will he do evil. It don't matter." These three areas bind fathers. And I wanted you to know of them this morning, but I didn't want to just leave you with them as bad news. I got good news. Jesus can break any of those cords. Jesus can break any of those binds in our life. Jesus made it clear in John's Gospel in the 8th chapter when he said to the Jews who believed him, "If you abide in my word, you're my disciples indeed. And you will know the truth. And guys, the truth will set you free." There is no greater freedom to be found than the freedom that comes when the Lord builds the house by building the father. The role of the father and the husband is to get as close to God as he can so that he can be the father and the husband in the roles that God has placed upon him. Sin causes bondage. But Jesus answered and said, most assuredly I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave to sin. Sin causes bondage, no doubt. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. Jesus can break that bondage and the hold that has on your life. If Satan can bind you, he can wreak havoc on your home. But Jesus can set you free. So in your castle, when Satan comes knocking on the gate, just send Jesus to answer the door, because he can't stand against him. Are you preparing your children for life? Are you providing for the needs of your family, both physically and spiritually, in the ways that honor God? Are you protecting your household from not only physical but spiritual threats from Satan's attacks and the attacks that we began to look at last week? But to do so, you're going to have to protect yourself from his snares that bind. If you found yourself bound this morning, I'm going to invite you to come back to Jesus to set you free. I asked the question, not the question, but I put out the picture. A man's house is his castle, or a man's home is his castle. I'm going to ask you the question, who's the king of your castle? You or God? Joshua said, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. Now, this is not a Father's Day message, but this is a message to fathers. And I just encourage you, if you would, to be able to stand with Joshua and say today, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, even if it takes a little changing of what's going on right now. Would you pray with me?